In GrayBruce, this is the territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the people of the Three Fires, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe, who gathered and governed here since time immemorial and who are represented today by the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, consisting of communities of Saugeen First Nation and the Chippewas of Nevash unceded First Nation at Nayashi-Iniginein. We also recognize these as the lands of the Métis Nation of Ontario. By gathering on these lands, we all are treaty people with all the relations and responsibilities that entails. At this moment of time, we also recognize the ongoing impacts of colonization on Indigenous people and the immense pain our Indigenous sisters and brothers are experiencing in the wake of the horrific findings of murdered children. So hello everybody to this evening with Jack Gibbons from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. So welcome Jack. Jack is the Director of Pollution Probe Energy Program. He's the chair and he's a powerful voice in the bid to phase out coal in Ontario's electricity mix, coal and gas. Jack studied economics at the University of Toronto, Queen's University, and the University of British Columbia. So it's really great to have you here, Jack.
Yes, so thanks for the introduction. And yes, I'm Jack Gibbons from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. And I just want to point out, while I did work for Pollution Probe in the past, I don't work there anymore. And the Ontario Clean Air Alliance was established in 1997 to promote the phase out of our 5 dirty coal-fired power plants. And we worked on that campaign for 17 years until the last coal plant was phased out in April 2014. And we're now working on the next step to clean up our electricity grid. That is, we're now working to create a 100% carbon-free electricity grid by 2030 by phasing out our gas-fired power plants. Now, this slide shows the historic and forecast greenhouse gas pollution from our electric power plants. And it goes from 2005 to 2040. And the good news is that thanks to the coal phase out, the greenhouse gas pollution from our electric power plants fell by 93% between 2005 and 2017, 93% reduction. But since 2017, the pollution from our gas-fired power plants has started to rise again. And according to the IESO, or Independent Electricity System Operator, the pollution from our gas plants is forecast to increase by more than 300% by 2030 and by 500% or more by 2040. And if this occurs, we will lose about 40% of the pollution reduction benefits that we achieve by phasing out dirty coal. Now, there's 3 main reasons why the IESO is forecasting this big rise in pollution from our electric power plants. The first reason is that they're forecasting that the demand for electricity in Ontario will grow by about 1% a year. The second reason is that they are forecasting that the Pickering nuclear station will close in 2025. And the third reason is that the government of Ontario is planning to meet virtually all of our need for new electricity supply over the next 20 years by simply ramping up the output of our gas-fired power plants. That is, they're going to meet our need for new electricity supply simply by importing more fracked gas from Western Canada and Pennsylvania and cranking up the gas plants. Now, Ontario also has a climate target. The province's climate target is to reduce our greenhouse gas pollution by 30% by 2030. But according to the Auditor General, we're not on track to achieve that target. But here's the good news. If we phase out the gas plants by 2030, that will provide Ontario with all or virtually all of the extra pollution reductions it needs to achieve its 2030 climate target. And so that's why we're calling for a gas plant phase out, because it's the easiest and lowest cost option for Ontario to achieve its 2030 climate target. Now we're proposing a three-pronged strategy to phase out the gas plants. The first prong is energy efficiency investments to reduce the demand for electricity and hence the need for the gas plants. The second prong is to import more low-cost water power from Quebec. Quebec has a huge surplus of water power, most of which is being exported to the United States, mostly on the spot market and mostly at very low prices. And so we think that some of those exports should be diverted to Ontario to help us phase out our gas plants. And the third prong of our strategy is to start investing in wind and solar energy again. Now, we all know that wind and solar used to be very high cost sources of electricity supply. And the McGuinty government paid very high prices for wind and solar. But in the last 10 years, thanks to huge technological progress, the cost of wind and solar energy has fallen dramatically. And as a result, wind and solar electricity are now our lowest cost sources of new electricity supply. And as a result, the Independent Energy Agency is forecasting that on a global basis, 95% of the world's new electricity supply during the next 5 years will be renewables, and primarily wind and solar. Now, the good news is that when we invest in energy efficiency and when we invest in wind and solar, we create jobs. We can create jobs in every single community in Ontario. On the other hand, if we meet our electricity needs by importing more frack gas from Alberta and Pennsylvania, we will create 0 new jobs in Ontario. Now, we all know that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So wind and solar do need a backup or a storage option. And that's why Ontario is so lucky to be located right next door to the province of Quebec, because Quebec's huge hydroelectric reservoirs can act like a giant battery for our wind and solar electricity. So by integrating our wind and solar with Quebec's hydroelectric reservoirs, we can convert wind and solar from an intermittent source of electricity into a firm 24/7 source of baseload electricity. So this means that we can use wind and solar to help phase out our gas-fired power plants, but we can also use wind and solar to phase out our nuclear plants, because with the help of Quebec's reservoirs, we can convert wind and solar into a source of baseload electricity. And now with electric vehicles, there's another a great storage option for wind and solar energy. When we have lots of wind and solar energy, when the sun's really shining or the wind's really blowing, we can use our electric vehicles' batteries to charge up during those times when there's lots of wind and solar electricity. So this is the good thing about electric vehicles. They all have batteries, and electric cars and trucks are parked most of the time. So they can be hooked up to the grid, and they can also not only charge up when we have surplus wind and solar, but also they can provide power back to the grid at times of peak demand. For example, you've probably heard of Ford's new F-150 Lightning pickup truck, 100% electric truck. And those trucks can supply 9.6 kilowatts to the grid. And to put this whole electric vehicle issue in perspective, Ontario has 9 million cars and trucks, 9 million cars and trucks. If by 2030, 1 million of these cars and trucks were electric, then they could provide 9,600 megawatts of power to the grid. So for example, on those hottest summer days when we're using our gas plants to the maximum, or on the coldest winter days when we're using the gas plants to the maximum, the electric vehicles, they could completely replace the need for the gas-fired power plants by 2030 if we had just a million of them hooked up to the power grid. So that's another great option for providing storage for wind and solar electricity, and for help us phase out the gas-fired power plants on the hottest and coldest days of the year. Now, I'm really pleased to note that so far 29 municipalities have passed resolutions calling on the government of Ontario to phase out our gas-fired power plants. And those 29 municipalities, they're all across Ontario. From in the west of Ontario, Windsor, up north to Sault Ste. Marie, and to the east all the way to Kingston. 29 municipalities representing over 50% of the population of Ontario have asked Premier Ford to phase out our gas-fired power plants. And I'm also really pleased to note that Andrea Horwath, the leader of the NDP and the leader of the opposition, plus Mike Schreiner, the leader of the Green Party, have also called for the phase out of our gas-fired power plants by 2030. And in the US, President Biden is calling for the US to phase out all fossil fuel electricity generation by 2035. And that's a really challenging goal for the US, because at the moment, the US gets 62% of its electricity from fossil fuels. Whereas here in Ontario, we only get about 6% of our electricity from fossil gas. So it will be very easy for us to achieve a complete phase out of our gas plants by 2030, 5 years in advance of the US. And now we come to Stephen Del Duca. He's the leader of the Liberal Party. And unfortunately, he so far hasn't called for the phase out of our gas-fired power plants. And we're quite surprised and disappointed by this. And it's surprising and disappointing, given that the previous leaders of the Liberal Party, Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, were very strong, provided very strong climate leadership. And so we need to get Stephen Del Duca on side, because he may be the next Premier of Ontario. So his email address is on the screen. And so if you can send him a message and ask him to call for a gas plant phase out by 2030, that would be great. Now, this slide shows the costs of Ontario's carbon-free electricity options. And the lowest cost options are on the left. And this slide reveals three very important facts. First, it reveals that the options that we're promoting to phase out the gas plants, energy efficiency, Quebec water power, solar power, onshore wind, are all lower costs than nuclear power. So what we're promoting are the lowest cost options to achieve a gas plant phase out. And to see that what I'm saying is true, I ask you to look at the yellow bar graph in the middle with 9.6 cents on top of it. This is the price for Ontario Power Generation's nuclear power today. Today, Ontario Power Generation is being paid 9.6 cents a kilowatt hour for each kilowatt hour of nuclear electricity that it produces. And so if you look to the left, you can see that all of the options that we're promoting are lower cost than 9.6 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's the first important fact. We are promoting the lowest cost options to phase out the gas-fired power plants. And the second important fact is that the price of nuclear electricity is going to rise, and it's going to rise very dramatically. If you look at the the yellow bar graph with 13.7 cents on top of it. That is what Ontario Power Generation has told the Ontario Energy Board its price of nuclear electricity must be in 2027 to pay for the rebuilding of its Darlington nuclear station. That is, the price of nuclear electricity is going to rise by more than 40% over the next 6 years. And to rebuild the Darlington nuclear station's 4 aging nuclear reactors. And that just doesn't make any economic sense, given that we can keep our lights on at a much lower cost by investing in energy efficiency, by buying Quebec water power, or by investing in wind and solar electricity. So what this slide shows you is not only can we use energy efficiency and renewables to phase out our gas plants, but we can use energy efficiency and renewables to also avoid the need to rebuilding our aging nuclear reactors. So if we aggressively promote energy efficiency, not only can we phase out the gas plants, but we can reduce the need for high-cost nuclear and actually lower our costs of electricity. We can reduce our electricity bills if we ramp up spending on energy efficiency and renewables and ramp down spending on nuclear rebuilds. So, you know, Doug Ford got elected on a promise to reduce our electricity bills by 12%. He hasn't done it, but if he wants to keep his promise to reduce bills by 12%, well, then he's going to have to ramp up investment spending on energy efficiency and renewables. And the third important fact, it can be seen by looking at the bar graph on the far right. That's with 16.3 cents on top of it. That is what the cost of electricity would be from a new nuclear reactor. Ontario Power Generation is proposing to build a new nuclear reactor in the GTA. It would produce electricity at a cost of 16.3 cents. And in our view, that proposal is completely economically absurd because it will be so high cost. Why would you pay 16.3 cents a kilowatt hour for nuclear electricity when you could, when we can keep our lights on at less than half the cost by investing in energy efficiency and by investing in renewables? And energy efficiency and renewables don't create highly toxic radioactive nuclear waste, which will last for hundreds of thousands of years. So the key message is we should be investing in energy efficiency and renewables to phase out our gas-fired power plants and also to reduce our need for nuclear rebuilds, to avoid the need to build new nuclear reactors. So this is the good news message, is by investing in energy efficiency and renewables, we can actually move Ontario to a 100% renewable electricity grid and lower electricity bills. It's a good news story.
Thank you so much. That was quite an advocacy for renewable energy in Ontario, which makes a lot of sense. And the question is often, why do we not change, right? Why do our provincial and municipal governments struggle or resist change? Jack, what would be your suggestion? And I think you have quite a bit of experience in that, how to approach municipal governments to address the options of phasing out fossil fuels and particularly gas, because up to now natural gas has been lobbied as clean and as low carbon emissions. So there's a certain kind of a mentor going around.
Okay, well, I think that there's two issues there. The use of fossil gas for electricity generation and the use of fossil gas for home heating instead of oil or propane in rural areas. So first, in terms of using fossil gas for electricity generation, so we've spoken to many municipalities. We've given them a PowerPoint presentation quite similar to the one I just gave to you tonight. And we've had great success getting municipalities on side. They understand there's a climate crisis. They understand the gas plants are a source of greenhouse gas pollution. They understand that Premier Ford's proposal to ramp up their output by 500% or more is going in the wrong direction. So we found it very easy to get municipal governments on side to phase out fossil gas electricity generation. People want to go to the cleaner alternatives. People like energy efficiency. They like renewables. Virtually everyone knows these are the better options, and these are the options we must pursue to deal with the climate crisis. Now, there's the other issue about home heating in rural areas. And here's the problem. I mean, as people know, oil and propane is a high-cost option for home heating. And what Enbridge is doing, excuse me, they're coming and they're offering fossil gas to homes. People are going to hook up their homes to fossil gas. And that will provide people in rural areas with lower bills. So it's an attractive option for people. But what you have to realize, while it will reduce, at least in the short run, the bills of customers in rural areas, it comes at a very high cost. It costs Enbridge a lot of money to hook up new homes in remote areas, because it means putting in lots more pipe in low density areas. So it's a very high cost operation for Enbridge. Now, Enbridge is a private corporation, is happy to do that because they just raise the rates of other customers to pay for these new hookups. And Enbridge, because of the way it's regulated by the Ontario Energy Board, their profits go up when they put more pipes in the ground. But from a provincial point of view, a much lower cost option to reduce the bills of rural customers, the home heating bills, would be for them to install cold water air sourced heat pumps or geothermal heat pumps. That would be a much lower cost option than expanding the fossil gas system, and it would be a much cleaner option. It wouldn't lead to an increase in greenhouse gas pollution. So what we're advocating is that the government of Ontario, instead of subsidizing the hookup of homes to fossil gas, they should be giving subsidies to homeowners to install cold weather air source heat pumps or geothermal heat pumps. That would be a much better option for customers in terms of bill reductions, and it would reduce greenhouse gas pollution.
How can hydrogen/wind power work into replacing natural gas? So what role basically can hydrogen play?
Well, Enbridge does advocate putting hydrogen as a blend into their fossil gas system. But what's important to note is that the amount of hydrogen that can be mixed in with fossil gas is a very small percentage of the total energy, and also that hydrogen is a very expensive option. So if we want to reduce our use of fossil gas, for example, for home heating, it's much more cost effective to focus on energy conservation and efficiency. to reduce the need for gas, and or to switch to heat pumps for the space heating after you've improved the thermal envelope of your home.
My question about hydrogen had to do with the fact that you may produce electricity when you don't need it. So that electricity could be used to create hydrogen, which you then could use to create electricity later on. That way replacing the natural gas. And that way it could be produced at location closer to the need too, which means there's less transmission losses. A number of people have talked about that. How do you think that might fit into what you're proposing?
Well, yes, that's a good point. And technically that's certainly possible. We could do that, but it's a very high cost option. When you make the hydrogen, there's an energy loss. And then when you turn the hydrogen back into electricity, there's an energy loss. So yes, technically you can do it, but it's very high cost. And we think the much better option when you have this surplus wind or solar electricity, there's a much better storage option. That is Hydro-Quebec's reservoirs. When we've got surplus wind or solar electricity, we should be exporting it to Quebec. Quebec can use it to keep the lights on in Montreal. And as a result, they can store more water in their reservoirs. And then when our wind and solar electricity is below average, they can use that extra water in their reservoirs to produce hydroelectricity for export back to Ontario. And so that's a much lower cost storage option and a much better way to deal with the problem when we have surplus wind or solar. And also, as I also mentioned, now that we're moving to electric vehicles, all those vehicles have batteries. All those cars will be parked for most of the day. And those batteries can be charged up at a time when we've got surplus solar and wind energy. So we think these are much lower cost options to deal with the problem of surplus wind and solar electricity than using it to produce hydrogen.
One thing I actually also heard is that some of the low-hanging fruit for a transition is, like you say, the vehicle to grid on school buses, because school buses, if they were to invest in electric battery school buses, they're parked through the summer months. They just act as batteries. I didn't want a question to get lost that came over email. So Kevin Tone asks, since we're talking about displacing energy types, is there any scenario that you could envision in which Ontario gas plants, so the existing gas plants, could export their power to displace coal into the US and therefore lower the overall emissions looking North America wide instead of just Canada wide? So displacing some of the oil and gas, the oil and coal in the US. What do you think, Jack?
Well, we certainly are exporting gas-fired electricity now. In 2019, 35% of our gas-fired generation was exported. And so we're actually advocating that we stop exporting gas-fired generation as part of our strategy to phase out the gas-fired power plants. And, you know, a lot of our gas, our frack gas does come from Pennsylvania and the US. So there's if the US wants to use a gas to displace their coal generation, well, they can produce the gas-fired electricity in the States. But what we would recommend is that the US should be investing in energy efficiency and investing in renewables to phase out their coal and their gas-fired generation. And that's certainly, you know, what President Biden is planning to do. He's not advocating that frack gas from the US be exported to Ontario to be burned in Ontario gas plants to be then exported back to the United States.
There's a question from Leslie. What obstacles are there to us getting Quebec energy? Why aren't we using it already? And I think many of us have been asking us that for a long time.
Oh, absolutely. That's a good question, and it comes up all the time. So yes, we do use Quebec water power now. We get about 3% of our electricity from Quebec water power. And with the existing transmission lines, we could triple our imports of Quebec water power tomorrow. So it is an option. And Kathleen Wynne, when she was Premier of Quebec, did sign a couple of medium-term contracts with Hydro-Quebec for power. And so that was a good step in the right direction, but they were for a very small amount of electricity. And why don't we import more? Well, because it's not in the financial self-interest of the Ontario power producers. It's important to remember that the two biggest power companies, electric power companies in Ontario, are OPG and Bruce Power. Combined, they produce more than 80% of our electricity, those two companies. And they do not want the government of Ontario to import low-cost water power from Quebec, because that would reduce their market share and reduce their profits. And as a result, they're a very powerful special interest political lobby that has has been very influential at Queen's Park and has persuaded premiers not to pursue the Quebec water power option. And to see the benefits of Quebec water power, you just have to look at the city of Cornwall. The city of Cornwall has obtained 100% of their electricity from Hydro-Quebec for 50 years. And the city of Cornwall has by far the lowest electricity rates of any city in Ontario. And during the 2003 blackout, their lights stayed on. Whereas in Ontario, it took us more than 8 days to return our electricity system to full power, to normal operations.
That's a great answer. Thank you. There's also another question. And do you happen to know if there are any municipalities in GrayBruce that have joined your campaign to ask Doug Ford not to add any more gas-fired plants?
Well, no, not yet. And we would certainly like to get some. And so if any of you can help us persuade your municipal councils to endorse a gas plant phase out, that would be great.
There seems to be a huge amount of disinformation flowing from the folks who want things to stay the way they are, about the disadvantages of renewables and the and misrepresenting the benefits of renewables. It's quite interesting. I mean, following the money is always a fun task because it lets you know the answers. Too often it's really hard to do anything with those answers, but it lets you know why the comments are coming where they're coming from. But you know, we're still missing the public education in crisis mode from senior levels of government.
Misinformation about the costs and the potential for energy efficiency and renewables is a big problem. Lots of people still think wind and solar are high costs, but actually now they're the lowest cost source of new supply. On our website, you can find links to, I think the link is called Get Involved, and where you can find links to the pamphlets we have. And so, for example, we have pamphlets about phasing out the gas-fired power plants. We have a pamphlet about not building a new nuclear reactor because wind and solar are much cleaner, safer, and lower cost options. So, for example, you could order those pamphlets and distribute them to voters in GrayBruce to help combat all this misinformation.
Yeah, information is a huge thing, and but you also mentioned earlier in some ways in your presentation that politics follow money, which is how it works in a capitalist system. So I think that is one of the great underlying problems here, right? To really make a big change, we need to kind of change the system that we have, right? So that eventually that the politics follow money. And we know how the McGuinty government struggled when they changed things and took the coal power plants off the grid. So I think you raised really great issues and talked about really important points. The question at the end of the day is like how do we move politics forward? And I think it's a great idea that, I mean, we can send pamphlets, we can send this information to our local politicians, municipalities, and provincial, but also federal representatives.
In politics of Ontario, which parties are we best to support? We are in a conservative riding, of course, but one time a few years back, we had Greens ran second. You remember that, folks?
Right.
So I don't know. What are the party stances on this?
We, at the moment, the Green Party and the NDP are calling for a gas plant phase out by 2030. But Stephen Del Duca hasn't taken a position yet. But so we need to persuade him to be a climate leader and also call for a gas plant phase out by 2030.
It seems to me shockingly short-sighted to allow all these new houses to be heated with natural gas, knowing full well that there's going to be a serious emergency sooner rather than later, and all of those systems are going to have to be converted. So I don't understand why they aren't putting, the government isn't putting a tax on natural gas so that it becomes more equivalent in cost to electricity, at least, you know, in the next 5 to 10 years, not necessarily tomorrow.
Well, that's a good point, and you're absolutely right. Connecting new homes to fossil gas is economically and environmentally irrational. It's a very stupid policy. But the sad fact is that Premier Ford loves fossil gas and he loves nuclear power. And he's ideologically opposed to wind and solar. And he doesn't really like energy conservation and efficiency either. And so he's a victim of very bad information. But so you're right, it makes no sense. And instead of the government subsidizing the hookup of homes to fossil gas, they should be giving subsidies to homeowners to install the cold weather air sourced heat pumps or geothermal heat pumps.
Yeah, I just wanted to say quickly that it doesn't matter what kind of fossil gas you're using. The main difference between those different gases is what the smell is that's added to them, so you know that they're around, and how they're packaged and distributed. It's all methane, and it's all many times worse than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But all this terminology is all trying to greenwash the industry and makes it really difficult to have the conversation.
Thank you, Jack, very much for tonight. I've been following you and Angela for over 20 years. I'm so glad that you mentioned the whole idea that no matter what type of energy source we use for producing our power, it still comes down to, from an individual point of view, and it can go into a community and a province-wide, is how much we use and how much we waste. And that has always been and always will be the determining factor that eventually, and hopefully sooner than later, will get enough people to recognize that it doesn't matter how cheap the fuel is. If you don't need the fuel, it's too expensive.
Right.
What is your feelings on that?
Well, I agree with you 100%. Energy efficiency, energy conservation is the cleanest and the lowest cost option. So that's what we should be focusing on. Absolutely.
Thank you, Jack, for giving us an hour of your time. It's really been really great to bounce our comments off of you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Wanted to mention that July 15th is our next third Thursday at Climate Forum, formerly known as GrayBruce. And it's be a special night, and hopefully you'll all join us again, and I'll issue you a challenge to bring a bunch of people with you, because we're going to be talking to 6 really great youth from Gray and Bruce and Nation and Saugeen. We'd like to get their takes on how to be heard by decision makers, how to stay motivated, how to get motivated to act, and how ourselves, allies of youth climate leaders, can support young activists. So again, that's July 15th, the third Thursday next month at 7 o'clock. So hopefully we'll see you then. And if you have any other suggestions for speakers, we'd love to hear them. You can email us at act@climateaction.team. But yeah, there's a challenge ahead of you. Please invite a bunch of people to support these young leaders. We'd love to have a great turnout to show them that we care and we're listening, and that we'll be their allies in the fight forward.
Well, Jack, if you want to listen to our young forum next month, you are welcome to join us too.
Thank you.
Okay, well, have a great night. Have a great summer solstice in a few days, and see you in a month. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.